Everyone laughed when the poor farmer inherited nothing but a rotted wagon. He thought life had mocked him again until he opened the door and saw what was inside. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning wind rolled through the brittle stalks of dead corn, whistling through the cracked boards of the fence and stirring the thin dust that clung to everything. Walter Green stood by the porch of his sagging farmhouse, his hands rough and veined, the skin browned and hardened from a lifetime beneath the sun. The house leaned like an exhausted animal, one side sinking where the ground had eroded during the last flood years ago. Beyond it stretched what was once a field of golden promise, now a plain of gray dirt where nothing had grown in 3 seasons. The Kansas wind carried only the sound of a lone mule braying somewhere behind the barn, as though mocking the silence that had settled over the place. Walter had long since given up counting the years since the last good harvest. Seasons blurred into one another, and days ended before they began. He had buried his wife a decade earlier and had not heard from his only son in more than 5 years. The boy had gone north to work in construction, promising to send letters, but the letters never came. What remained was habit, the rhythm of small repairs, feeding the mule named Sam, patching leaks in the roof, checking on fences that no longer held any livestock. It was not pride that kept him there, not even hope. It was the inertia of a man who had worked the same land his entire life and no longer knew what to do except endure it. He did not dream anymore, but he had not learned to give up either. The postman came once a week, and usually there was nothing but bills, reminders from the bank, or catalogs for things he could never afford. But that morning, when the dust rose behind the mail truck, he felt a faint tremor of anticipation that he could not explain. The postman stepped out, handed him a single thick envelope with a government seal and said, "Looks official, Mr. Green." Walter turned it over. The return address bore the stamp of a courthouse 2 states west. The words "Official Notice of Inheritance" were printed across the top. For a long time he simply stood there, staring at it, the dry wind fluttering the corners. His heart, which had forgotten excitement, stirred like a reluctant engine. Inside, he tore it open with his calloused fingers, unfolded the letter, and read that he was the sole beneficiary of one Fielding Green, a distant relative, the brother of his grandfather. He had inherited property, structures, livestock, and equipment. The letter listed coordinates, a deed number, and an instruction to appear within 90 days to claim the estate. For several minutes he could not breathe. He sat heavily in the wooden chair by the window and read the letter again, tracing each word like a man reading a secret code. A farm, equipment, livestock. The words felt unreal, but they carried the weight of something solid. It was a promise, and after years of struggle, Walter clung to that promise as though it were a rope dropped into a pit. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the table as if it might vanish if he looked away. For the rest of the day, he moved through his routine like a man in a dream. By evening, he had decided he would go. He had nothing left to lose, and perhaps at last, something to gain. That night, the wind rattled the loose shutters and rain tapped at the window panes. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining a place that might save him. A broad ranch, a clean barn, rows of cattle, maybe even a white porch like those he had seen in magazines years ago. He could almost hear laughter again, the way it used to sound before time hollowed it out. 2 days later, he sold the few tools he still owned, filled a can with gasoline, packed a bag, and loaded his old pickup with the essentials: an oil lantern, a shovel, a rope, and a faded photograph of his late wife. Sam the mule stood in the yard, watching him with eyes that seemed almost human, and Walter whispered, "You're coming with me, old friend." The road stretched westward beneath an endless sky. He drove through miles of open plains, passing through towns that had died long before he arrived, their storefronts boarded up, their gas pumps rusting like forgotten monuments. Every few hours he stopped for gas or water, his mind drifting between disbelief and fragile hope. The closer he came to the coordinates, the lonelier the landscape became. The horizon turned red with dust, and the road narrowed into a dirt path flanked by dry weeds and abandoned machinery, half buried in the earth. Once or twice he passed empty farmhouses leaning on broken foundations, the windows like blind eyes staring at him. He began to wonder if he was driving not toward a new life, but into the graveyard of all the old ones. Yet the thought of turning back never crossed his mind. He followed the directions until the road ended at a wooden sign so weathered that only a few letters remained. Green. County line. Beyond it lay a stretch of land that looked untouched for decades. The sun was sinking when he finally saw it, a small rise of ground with a shape standing alone against the fading light. He parked the truck, stepped out, and felt the ground crunch beneath his boots. There, at the center of the clearing, stood what might once have been a shed or a barn. Its walls were blackened with age, its roof sagged in the middle, and the door hung on one hinge. Beside it rested a wooden wagon, its wheels sunken into the dirt, the planks gray with rot. The sight struck him like a blow. He walked closer, the envelope still in his pocket. The wagon's side bore carved letters, barely legible beneath the grime. FG, the initials of the man whose death had brought him here. Inside the shed, there was nothing but darkness and the smell of old timber and decay. No animals, no fences, no trace of the ranch. The letter had promised only silence. For a long moment, Walter stood in that silence, his mind refusing to accept what he saw. He looked back across the field, hoping there might be another structure hidden by distance. But there was only emptiness stretching to the horizon. The dream that had carried him across 2 states cracked and fell apart, leaving only the echo of the wind. He sat on the wagon's broken wheel and rubbed the dust from his hands. The sky turned crimson, the light fading into a dull rust, and a bitter laugh escaped his throat. He had driven hundreds of miles for this, a rotted wagon and a piece of barren ground. The disappointment was sharp enough to draw tears, but his eyes were too dry to give them. He whispered into the wind, asking no one, "What kind of joke is this?" There was no answer but the creak of the shed door swaying gently in the breeze. The next morning he walked the boundaries of the land. The ground was cracked and brittle, dotted with the remains of weeds. He found no sign of any buried equipment, no foundation stones, no fencing wire. It seemed impossible that anyone had ever worked this soil. When the sun reached its peak, he drove to the nearest town, a cluster of wooden buildings and a single gas station. A man behind the counter looked up when Walter asked about Fielding Green and smirked. "You must be the new owner," he said. "Old Fielding's legacy, huh? That's what's left of it, the wagon and a few acres of dust." In the bar across the street, the laughter was louder. They told him the story of the old man who lived alone out there, talking to himself, refusing to sell his worthless land. They said he was mad, convinced that something lay beneath his property worth guarding. "Died in that wagon, I heard," one man said. "Didn't even have a roof over his head. You want my advice, mister? Leave that place to the coyotes." Their laughter followed him out into the street. Walter's face burned, not from shame but from anger. He had been made a fool, and yet something in those words stayed with him, the mention that the old man refused to sell. He drove back at sunset, his jaw set, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he reached the clearing, the land looked even more desolate than before. The air carried the smell of dust and dry sage, and the wagon loomed in the half-light like a coffin. He decided to stay the night, if only to convince himself there was nothing there. He built a small fire, cooked the last of his canned beans, and sat watching the sparks rise into the dark. The silence pressed around him until it seemed almost alive. He looked again at the wagon, noticing for the first time how the boards along its bottom were mismatched, some newer than the rest, hammered hastily into place. Curious, he stepped closer, running his fingers along the grain of the wood. The boards sounded hollow when he tapped them. He crouched, pulled at one with his pocket knife, and the nail came loose. Beneath it, wedged between 2 planks, was a thin bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, to his surprise, he found a small folded map and a scrap of paper. The map was crude but clear enough, a square of land marked with a rough X right under the wagon's position. On the back of the map, written in faded ink, were 4 words, "Don't let them take it." The fire behind him crackled, and a gust of wind scattered the ashes. He looked around the empty field, feeling suddenly watched. The wagon groaned softly, as if shifting under its own weight, though there was no one near. Walter slipped the map into his coat pocket and stood very still. For a moment he thought he heard the faint jingle of metal from inside the wagon, like a chain dragging across wood. He told himself it was just the wind, yet the sound persisted, a faint scraping beneath the boards. He took a step closer, the lantern's glow trembling in his hand. The air grew colder. Then from within the darkness of the wagon came a single dull thud, followed by silence. Walter froze, his breath caught in his throat. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. He waited listening, but the sound did not come again. And yet he could not shake the feeling that something inside the wagon had just moved, something that had been waiting for a very long time. Walter didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the wagon sounded like a whisper, and every gust of wind against the boards made his pulse quicken. The memory of that dull thud beneath the wood would not leave his mind. He lay beside the dying fire, staring into the dark, the map clutched in his hand. The faint markings on the paper glimmered in the lantern's glow, in the 4 words written on the back. "Don't let them take it," echoed inside his skull. By dawn, the fire had burned to gray ash. When he rose, his back ached, his throat was dry, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The wagon stood silent now, still and harmless in the morning light, as though mocking his unease. He spent the early hours exploring the land, searching for any sign of what the map could mean. The coordinates were vague, the lines uneven. He walked across the cracked soil, the brittle stems of weeds snapping beneath his boots, and saw only emptiness stretching in all directions. The earth here was gray and lifeless, as if the rain had forgotten it for 100 years. By midday, with the sun burning overhead, he gave up and returned to the wagon. The emptiness of it all pressed against him until it became unbearable. He needed to see people, to hear voices, even if they belonged to strangers. So he took the old pickup and drove toward the small town he'd passed on his way in. Green Creek was little more than 3 streets and a handful of weary buildings. The main road cut through the middle like a scar. There was a gas station with a single pump, a hardware store that looked half abandoned, and a diner whose windows were so dusty they turned the morning light to sepia. A dog lay in the shade of the awning, watching him with lazy suspicion. Walter parked beside the diner and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled weakly. A few men sat at the counter, hunched over coffee and biscuits. Their conversation stopped when they saw him. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a weary smile, approached. "You're not from around here," she said. Walter nodded and ordered coffee. When she poured it, he asked if she knew of a man named Fielding Green. The moment the name left his mouth, one of the men at the counter let out a low chuckle. Another said, "Well, I'll be damned. The legend lives on." They turned to look at him with amusement rather than hostility, the kind reserved for a fool who didn't yet know he'd made a mistake. The waitress smirked. "Fielding Green's place? That old patch of dirt? Honey, if that's what brought you out here, you might as well turn around and go home." Laughter rippled through the room. A heavy-set man in overalls leaned back in his chair and said, "You mean to tell us you inherited that?" Walter said nothing. The man continued, "Well, congratulations. You now own the most cursed acre in the county. That's all that old fool left behind. A wagon and a pile of splinters." Another voice chimed in from the back. "He used to walk into town muttering about thieves and water under the ground. Folks said he was crazy. Wouldn't sell, wouldn't leave. Died out there talking to ghosts." Walter forced a faint smile, but inside anger coiled like a spring. "He left something," he said quietly, "something worth keeping." The laughter grew louder, not cruel exactly, but dismissive, pitying. The waitress refilled his cup and murmured, "Don't mind them. That old man was trouble, and his land's worse. Nobody's worked it in 50 years. There's nothing out there but bad luck." She hesitated before adding, "They say he kept things buried, though. Always digging. Some nights folks could see his lantern moving under the hill." Her tone shifted, half whisper, half jest. "Maybe you'll find what he was looking for." Walter finished his coffee without replying. When he stood, the laughter followed him to the door. Outside, the heat wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The sky shimmered, and even the wind seemed too tired to move. He stopped by the general store to ask about supplies, oil for the lantern, a shovel, a few nails, and a small hammer. But when the storekeeper heard his name, he gave the same knowing grin. Green's land, huh? My advice? Leave it alone. That soil's got no use for the living. By the time Walter returned to the property, the sun was sliding low, staining the horizon in red and gold. He parked the truck and sat for a long time without moving. The laughter from the diner still echoed in his mind. All those faces, smug and knowing, as though they'd already written his story for him. Another fool chasing ghosts. He climbed out of the truck, took the shovel, and walked to the wagon. The wind had shifted. It carried a dry, metallic scent. Standing there in the fading light, he realized how small the wagon truly was. A coffin on wheels, weathered and hollow. And yet, there was something deliberate about the way it sat on the ground, as if it had been placed there for a reason. He crouched beside it, running his hand along the bottom planks. They were uneven, nailed together carelessly, as though someone had mended them in haste. One of the boards had a faint crack along its edge. He pressed the tip of the shovel into the gap, pried gently, and the plank came loose with a soft groan. Beneath it lay a layer of dry earth. He brushed it aside and something glimmered. Not metal, but paper sealed in waxed cloth. His pulse quickened. He pulled it free and sat back against the wheel. Inside the cloth was a small yellowed envelope, the seal long broken but still faintly marked with initials. FG. He unfolded the brittle paper inside. It wasn't a letter. It was a page torn from a notebook, covered in tight handwriting. He could barely read the words, but a few stood out. Truth, land, water. There was also a drawing, crude lines forming the shape of the property, and again, that same cross he'd seen on the map. The page was dated more than 40 years ago. A chill crept through him. He placed the paper carefully back inside the envelope and looked again beneath the wagon. The space below was shallow, no deeper than a few inches of packed soil. If there was more hidden here, it would be further down. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the field. He decided to dig. The ground was hard, but it yielded slowly beneath his shovel. Each strike sent a vibration up his arms. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rasp of metal against dirt. When he paused to catch his breath, he thought he heard a faint sound, a soft rattle, like pebbles shifting somewhere nearby. He turned, scanning the empty horizon, but saw nothing. The air was still. The only movement came from the flickering flames of his small fire, just beginning to take in the breeze. After an hour, the hole was no more than a shallow pit. He found nothing but roots and stones. Frustration gnawed at him. He threw the shovel down and sat on the ground, breathing hard. The night air cooled around him, carrying the faint scent of smoke and sage. His thoughts returned to the people in town, the way they laughed, the way they looked at him as though he were already beaten. He clenched his fists. "You'll see," he muttered to no one. "You'll all see." He stood and climbed into the wagon, determined to search it again before sleep. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of rotten rust. The floorboards creaked under his weight. In the corner, he found what remained of a blanket, stiff with age, and an old metal cup coated with dust. There was a single broken lantern hanging from the ceiling beam. It swayed slightly as he moved, the chain squeaking. Beneath the beam, the floor dipped just enough to make him notice. Kneeling, he ran his fingers along the seams of the boards. One section felt loose. He pressed his thumb against it. It gave slightly like a lid. Using the end of his knife, he pried it open. A small cavity lay beneath. Inside, there was a tin box, rusted but intact. His heart thudded as he lifted it into the lamplight. The hinges squealed when he opened it. Inside were folded papers tied with a strip of leather and a small brass compass, its needle trembling as though aware of the attention. He untied the leather and unfolded the first page. The handwriting matched the note he'd found earlier. The words were written in careful, deliberate script. "I have no heirs but the land itself. Let it remember what men tried to erase. They came for the water, not for the soil. Beneath this earth lies what they stole from us. If you are blood of my blood, then you must guard it, for they will return when the ground calls again." The remaining pages were letters, dozens of them, perhaps written over years. They told fragments of a story, a dispute, a betrayal, a lost inheritance. Each one mentioned the same thing, a hidden source of water, a well or a vein that could feed the entire valley. The old man had tried to prove it existed, but no one believed him. He lost his land, his family, everything. The final letter ended abruptly, the ink blurred by what might have been rain or tears. Walter sat motionless, the letters trembling in his hands. The air in the wagon felt different now, heavy, as if the past itself were pressing close. He realized with a jolt that he was sitting exactly where the old man must have sat, writing those same words by the light of the same lantern. For the first time, he felt something more than curiosity, something like obligation. Outside, the night deepened. The stars flickered weakly through the dust haze. He stepped out, clutching the tin box to his chest, and looked out over the silent land. The moon was rising, pale and cold. A breeze rustled through the dry weeds, whispering along the ground. He could almost hear the echo of a voice carried with it, faint and sorrowful, though he could not tell if it came from memory or the wind itself. He stared toward the horizon, where the soil turned darker, where the ground seemed to dip slightly toward a low ridge. Perhaps that was where the mark on the map pointed. Perhaps that was where the truth waited. He glanced back at the wagon. Its shadow stretched long and black behind him, and for an instant it seemed to breathe. The boards creaking, the lantern chains swaying though the air was still. He tightened his grip on the box and turned toward his campfire. The flames had burned low, the last embers glowing red like eyes in the dark. The land was utterly silent now, and that silence carried something cold, expectant. Walter knelt by the fire, feeding it another stick of wood, and the light flickered across his face. He looked again at the note that had begun it all, the one from the map, with its stark warning, "Don't let them take it." He thought of the laughter in town, of the way those men had looked at him, and he felt a slow, grim resolve settling inside him. If there was something buried here, something the old man had died protecting, he would find it. And if there were men who wanted it taken, he would make sure they failed. As the last flame caught the wood, a sound reached him from beyond the firelight, a faint rumble, distant but distinct. He turned his head, listening. It came again, closer this time, like the hum of an engine carried by the wind. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing. Far across the plain, two pale lights blinked once, then vanished. The night swallowed them whole. For a moment the silence returned. Then the wind rose, cold and sudden, and the wagon behind him let out a long, low groan, as though something inside had finally begun to wake. The rumble of the distant engine faded into the dark until there was nothing left but the whisper of wind brushing across the dry plain. Walter stood motionless, his hand tight on the rusted tin box he had found beneath the wagon's floor. The last light of the fire flickered against the curve of his jaw, casting shadows that stretched across the dirt. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon where those two pale lights had been, but the night now held only silence. Still, something inside him knew that he had not imagined it. Someone had been out there watching. He turned back toward the wagon, its silhouette black against the faint silver of the moon. It looked fragile, hollow, as though one strong gust could scatter it into splinters, and yet it felt like the only thing anchoring him to this place. When morning came, the land was still, covered in a thin veil of dust that turned the rising sun into a dull red disk. Walter drank the last of his coffee and studied the papers again. The letters inside the tin box were too fragile to handle for long, their edges crumbling under his fingertips. But each line he managed to read painted a clearer picture of the man who had once lived here. Fielding Green had been stubborn, proud, and alone, just like him. The words spoke of betrayal, of court hearings, of men who had stolen his rights to the land and silenced him when he tried to speak. Yet among the bitterness was something else, determination, a belief that the truth would survive beneath the earth until someone found it again. Walter spread the map across the hood of his truck. The paper was faded, the ink uneven, but the marks were clear enough to form a path leading away from the wagon toward the edge of the property. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards toward a shallow depression in the ground where the color of the soil darkened. He remembered the faint dip he had noticed the night before, and realized this was no coincidence. The map pointed directly to it. He glanced once more toward the empty road beyond the fence. There were no tire tracks now, no sign that anyone had come or gone, but the memory of those headlights lingered like a bruise in his thoughts. He gathered his shovel and the lantern, slung his canteen over his shoulder, and walked out across the field. The air was dry, and each step kicked up a puff of dust. Sam, the mule, followed at a slow distance, ears twitching warily. When they reached the depression, Walter paused. The ground there was different, harder, compacted as though pressed down by weight long ago. He knelt and brushed aside the top layer of dirt. It was smooth, almost unnaturally so. The point of the shovel struck something solid. A hollow thud echoed beneath the surface. His heart gave a small jolt. He knelt lower, clearing more earth, and soon the edge of a round metal surface emerged, dark, rusted, but unmistakably man-made. It was a lid, wide as the hood of a car, set into the ground and sealed with bolts corroded by time. The sound of the shovel against it sent a metallic ring through the air. Walter sat back, breathless. This was what Fielding had been hiding, what the letters had hinted at. A cover to something buried deep, perhaps a well, or a reservoir, or maybe something else entirely. He worked for hours, clearing the soil around it until the lid was fully exposed. The sun climbed higher, the light growing harsh, but he barely noticed. Sweat streaked his temples, his hands blistered, yet he kept going until he could run his fingers along the metal edge. Near the center, he found a small groove shaped like a handle. He dug his fingers in and pulled. The lid resisted, sealed tight by rust, but after several hard tugs, it gave a dry groan and lifted slightly. A rush of cold, damp air burst from below, carrying the faint scent of minerals and old earth. He leaned over the opening and felt the breath of the underground rise against his face. The air was moist, alive in a way that the surface was not. It smelled of water. He hurried back to the truck, fetched a length of rope, and tied it around the base of a nearby post. Lowering the lantern into the opening, he saw the faint reflection of light shimmering off liquid far below. His pulse raced. The letters had been right. The water was still there. Fielding had known. For years, the old man had been sitting above an underground vein that could have fed the whole valley, while the towns around had dried and withered. Walter felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. The discovery filled him with purpose, but also with the weight of what it meant. If others learned of this, they would come for it, just as they had come for Fielding decades ago. He pulled the lantern back up and replaced the lid, pressing it down until it sealed. Then he sat beside it, staring at the barren land that stretched endlessly outward. In his mind, he could already see what might grow here: green fields, herds of cattle, maybe even families returning. The thought almost made him smile. But as the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of a motor somewhere far away, his smile faded. Whoever had come in the night might not have gone far. That evening, the horizon glowed red as the sun dipped behind the hills. Walter cooked a small meal over the fire and sat reading more of Fielding's letters. One of them spoke directly of the danger. They call themselves Harlan Water and Resources now. They wear suits and carry deeds, but they are the same men who came with shovels and threats. If you see their name again, be wary. Walter's pulse quickened as he remembered the cigarette butt he had found by the road, its paper stamped with that same name. He looked toward the distant fields, now turning purple with dusk. There was no movement, but the unease in his chest tightened. As darkness fell, he decided to take precautions. He returned to the lid, brushed dirt over it, and scattered rocks until it looked like part of the landscape again. Then he moved the wagon a few feet, its rotting wheels creaking like an old animal. The effort nearly broke his back, but it hid the disturbed ground beneath its shadow. When he finished, he leaned against the wheel, breathing heavily. The stars began to appear, faint and cold. He thought again of the townspeople's laughter, of the way they dismissed him. They didn't know what slept beneath this land. They saw only failure and dust. But he knew now there was something deeper, something powerful enough to change everything. He stared up at the night sky, whispering a promise to the memory of Fielding Green. They won't take it from me. Not again. The night grew colder. The mule shifted restlessly near the truck, ears flicking toward the road. Walter heard it too then, a distant crunch of gravel, faint but distinct. He froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the low hum of an engine idling somewhere beyond the trees. He extinguished the fire and waited. Minutes passed. Then headlights flared briefly on the far ridge, sweeping across the land like the beam of a searching eye before vanishing again. Walter's breath caught in his throat. He crouched in the shadows, watching. Whoever was out there was patient. They didn't approach, didn't call out, just waited as if confirming something. Then just as quietly, the lights turned off completely. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that listened back. He stayed awake until dawn, his hand on the handle of the shovel, the letters beside him wrapped carefully in the oilcloth. When the first light crept over the horizon, he saw fresh tire marks along the dirt road leading to his property. They hadn't been there the day before. He followed them a few yards until they turned back toward town. The tracks were deep, heavy. Whoever had come had driven a large vehicle. The prints of their boots were visible in the dust near the fence, pointing toward the wagon and then away again. Someone had been close enough to see everything. He felt the chill of realization sink through him. He spent the morning hiding the tin box and papers inside the wagon's remaining hollow, sealing it with the old boards. Then he gathered what tools he could and went back to the lid. This time, he marked its edges in his mind and memorized the way the rocks lay around it. He would not dig again until he was ready, but he would not lose it either. As he covered the last traces of disturbed earth, he looked up and saw movement in the distance, a flicker of sunlight on glass. A pair of binoculars maybe, or just the gleam of a windshield. It was impossible to tell. He turned away, forcing his mind to stay calm. That night, as he sat by a smaller fire, the mule brayed sharply, startling him. He stood scanning the darkness. The wind carried the scent of gasoline faintly through the air. His heart pounded. He grabbed the lantern and stepped toward the wagon, its boards glowing faintly under the flicker of the flame. There was nothing there. No movement, no sound, but a single fresh footprint marked the dust beside one of the wheels. It was not his. Walter stared at it for a long time, the flame trembling in his hand. Somewhere out there, someone knew he had found something worth protecting. He could feel the unseen eyes watching even now, patient, waiting for him to make a mistake. He covered the footprint with dirt, doused the lantern, and whispered into the darkness, "You won't take it either." Then he sat down against the wagon's wheel, the tin box hidden beside him under the loose boards, the letters whispering of old crimes and stolen water. Above him, the sky spread vast and empty, 1,000 stars glinting like the heads of buried nails. And from somewhere out in the night came the soft click of a car door closing, followed by silence so complete that even the mule stopped breathing. The dawn that followed was pale and thin, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over that forgotten stretch of land. Walter woke to the faint rattle of the mule's harness and the cool touch of the morning breeze carrying the smell of dust and iron. He had not really slept. His dreams were made of footsteps, of whispers that dissolved whenever he turned toward them. The memory of that closing car door haunted him, though he could not say if it had truly happened or if his exhaustion had turned the silence into something alive. When he stepped out of the wagon, the air was still, and the horizon shimmered under the first faint light. The footprint he had covered the night before had vanished beneath the wind's thin veil of sand, but he did not feel relief, only the uneasy certainty that whoever had been there would return. He started his day in silence. The small fire he built gave off little warmth, and the coffee he brewed was bitter, but he drank it slowly while studying the field around him. The wagon cast a long shadow across the ground, falling directly over the place where the hidden lid lay buried. He realized that this might have been intentional, that Fielding Green had chosen this exact spot not for comfort or shelter, but for concealment. The letters had spoken of deceit, of theft, of a company that had taken more than land from him. Now Walter began to see how deep that theft might have gone. He folded the papers carefully back into their cloth wrapping, checked that the tin box was hidden, and turned toward the rising light. The soil beneath his boots was hard, but further out, near the ridge where the land dipped, he noticed the faint shimmer of moisture. He walked there slowly, scanning the ground. A few tufts of grass clung to life near the edge. their color slightly greener than the rest of the field. He knelt and pressed his palm to the dirt. It was cool, not as dry as it should have been. Somewhere below, the underground vein of water was close enough to breathe life into this forgotten place. He could almost hear it, a ghostly murmur deep beneath the surface. The realization steadied him. This land wasn't dead, it was merely waiting. By midday, he had gathered his tools and decided to uncover the hidden lid once more. The memory of the previous day's discovery burned in his mind, a mixture of fear and wonder. He worked carefully, removing the rocks and dust he had used to cover it, until the rough circle of corroded metal appeared again. The bolts resisted him, but with patience he managed to loosen one, then another, until he could pry the lid open an inch. The stale breath of the underground rose again, damp and heavy, like the sigh of something ancient. He lowered the lantern through the gap, the flame trembling in the draft. The light reflected faintly off the surface of water far below, calm and dark, its ripples whispering against unseen walls. He could not tell how deep it ran, but the sight filled him with a fierce, wordless awe. The old man had not been mad. Everything he had said in those letters was true. He pulled the lantern back up, secured the lid, and sat beside it, his mind racing. That water could change everything. It could restore the land, maybe even bring others back to settle here. It was more than wealth, it was rebirth. But it was also the reason men had once come with forged deeds and lies. They would come again. He had no doubt of that now. The letters had named them the Harlan Company. Walter had seen their name before on the cigarette butt near the fence, on the documents that had nearly stripped his own father of land decades ago. It all tied together in a way that made his stomach tighten. Fielding had fought them alone and died protecting the secret. Walter, whether he wanted to or not, had taken his place. Late that afternoon, a car approached from the distance. Walter heard the engine before he saw the dust it kicked up along the road. He wiped his hands on his jeans, stood, and waited. The vehicle stopped a few yards away, a dark SUV, polished, out of place amid the desolation. A man in a gray suit stepped out, adjusting his tie as though the wind were an inconvenience. He was in his 50s, tall, and his smile was practiced, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Green, I presume?" he said. "My name's Mason. I represent Harlan Water and Resources. I believe we need to discuss the property lines here." Walter's mouth went dry. "Property lines?" The man nodded politely. "Yes, there seems to have been a clerical error some years ago. This parcel was mistakenly recorded as private land, but it's actually part of our company's survey region. You understand how paperwork can be, especially with these old deeds." He laughed softly as if to make it sound trivial. "We'd like to clear it up. My superiors are prepared to offer a fair compensation for your time and for any inconvenience." Walter stared at him. "This land was given to me legally. I have the papers." "I'm sure you do," Mason replied smoothly. "But the records office might see it differently. You see, the Green property was in dispute long before you were born. It would be unfortunate to get entangled in a matter like that. Lawyers, fees, it can get messy. We're offering you the simple way out." He reached into his pocket and produced an envelope, holding it out as if offering a favor. Walter didn't take it. "What's under this land that's worth lying for?" he asked. The smile faltered for a moment, then returned. "Mr. Green, you misunderstand. We're just trying to resolve an old mistake. Nothing more." "I read the letters," Walter said quietly. "I know what's buried here." The man's expression hardened. For the first time, his voice lost its charm. "Be careful what you think you know. Sometimes a man finds things better left alone." He turned back to the SUV, his tone resuming its polite rhythm. "I'll leave you to think about our offer. I'll return in a few days. I hope by then you'll be reasonable." When the vehicle disappeared down the road, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Walter stood for a long time staring at the tracks in the dirt until the wind began to erase them. He knew what would happen next. If they couldn't buy him, they would try to frighten him, and if that failed, they would destroy him the same way they had destroyed Fielding Green. The thought lit a slow, cold fire inside him. That night he did not sleep. He sat near the wagon, rifle resting across his knees, listening to the endless whisper of the wind. The moon rose, silver and cold, lighting the field in pale shadows. Every sound a shifting board. The call of an owl made his muscles tense. Near midnight he smelled it, smoke. Faint at first, then stronger. He turned toward the wagon and saw a flicker of orange beneath the boards. The dry wood caught quickly. Flames raced along the side, crackling, devouring the ancient timber that had hidden the truth for decades. Walter ran to it, grabbed his coat, and beat at the fire, choking on the smoke that rolled upward in black waves. The mule shrieked and pulled at its tether. By the time he smothered the last flame, half the wagon was gone. The air stank of ash and burned resin. He fell to his knees, coughing, his hands blistered and blackened. In the glow of the dying embers, he saw the lid of the underground vault gleaming faintly through the soot. Whoever had started the fire had aimed to destroy evidence, but they hadn't found the water. The letters in the tin box, hidden under a loose stone nearby, were safe. Walter sat back, breathing hard, staring into the ruin that had once been Fielding's home. As the night wind rose, scattering ash across the field, he felt the full weight of what he was now part of. The fire was not just a warning, it was a message. The company had known all along what lay beneath the land, and they were ready to burn the past to bury it again. He looked toward the dark horizon where the SUV had vanished and whispered through gritted teeth, "You didn't finish the job. Not this time." The stars above shimmered faintly through the smoke, cold and indifferent, as if watching another cycle of the same old story, men taking, others resisting, and the earth itself keeping its secrets until someone dared to dig again. Walter rose slowly, the burned boards crackling beneath his boots, and turned toward the faint outline of the ridge. Somewhere under that land, the water still moved, alive and waiting. He knew now what he had to do. When dawn came again, it found him standing beside the ruins of the wagon with a shovel in his hand, his face blackened with soot, but his eyes bright with determination. The flames had not destroyed his resolve. They had forged it. Whatever it took, he would uncover what Fielding had guarded, and he would make the land live again. But even as the sun climbed over the horizon, the faint sound of engines echoed once more from far away, reminding him that the past never stayed buried for long. The air still smelled of smoke when the morning came. The ashes of the burned wagon drifted across the soil, pale and weightless, scattering like the remnants of an old secret. Walter stood beside the ruin with his eyes half closed, listening to the soft hiss of wind through the grass. The land looked wounded now, scarred by the fire, but beneath that charred surface he felt the steady pulse of something alive. The buried water, deep and constant, waiting to rise. He had spent most of the night guarding what little remained, dragging the tin box and the letters into the safety of his truck, dousing every ember until the ground steamed. What had once been Fielding's shelter was gone, yet the thing Fielding had died protecting had survived. That thought alone gave him strength, even as fatigue weighed on him like a stone. By midday, the horizon shimmered under a white sun. He filled a bucket with water from his canteen and poured it over the blackened boards to cool them. Then he walked the edge of the property, scanning for footprints, tire marks, anything that might tell him who had come in the night. He found nothing clear, only scattered impressions in the dust, the trace of boot heels near the fence line, and a crushed cigarette filter bearing the same faint blue stamp he'd seen before. The company's men had returned, this time with fire instead of words. The anger that had been simmering in him hardened into something colder. He could still hear Mason's voice in his mind, polite and poisonous, promising that this land was an error easily fixed. Walter knew now that they would not stop. They would keep coming until they claimed what lay beneath, until the truth itself was buried again. He could feel it in the way the wind carried distant echoes of engines along the valley, in the quiet that settled too quickly after sundown. He drove into town that afternoon, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to know what the people there were saying. The road shimmered in the heat, dust swirling behind him like smoke. Green Creek looked smaller than ever, its buildings drooping under the weight of years. When he pulled up outside the diner, the same men were there, sitting by the windows with their coffee cups. Conversation died the moment he stepped through the door. The waitress gave him a long, uncertain look. "Heard there was a fire out your way," she said softly. "Everything all right?" Walter nodded. It's fine. One of the men laughed under his breath. That old wagon finally gave up, huh? Maybe it's for the best. You can stop playing minor and go home? Walter ignored him. You know anyone named Mason? Works for Harlan Water and Resources? The laughter faded. The same man's smirk stiffened. Why are you asking? They came to my land, Walter said. Said it belonged to them. The waitress frowned. That company? They've been sniffing around these parts for decades. Wanted to buy up the whole valley back when there was still rain. Folks said they found oil, or water, or something, but they left after the old green died. Guess they're back. Sarah, the man at the counter, muttered, Don't mess with them. You think you own that dirt, but they've got the papers and the law. You push too hard, you'll disappear like the last ones who tried. Walter paid for his coffee and left without another word. As he stepped outside, the wind picked up, tossing grit against his boots. He turned back once and saw them all watching from the window, not with cruelty this time, but with a kind of fearful pity. They had seen this story before. Men like him came, full of fight, and vanished when the wrong people took interest. The town had learned not to remember too much. Back on the property, he found the mule restless, stamping its hooves near the ridge. The animal's ears twitched toward the west, and when Walter looked in that direction, he saw the faint glint of sunlight on glass again, a vehicle parked on the distant road, watching. It did not move. He felt their eyes even from here. They were patient, testing him, waiting for his resolve to crumble. Instead, he went back to the lid. He uncovered it slowly, brushing away the soot and ash until the metal gleamed. This time, he pried it open further, lowering the lantern until the light reached the bottom. The pool of water reflected back the flame, steady and still. He could almost see his own face in it, drawn and weary but determined. The water wasn't just survival, it was proof, a living record that the old man had been right all along. He needed to protect it, but more than that, he needed to make the world see it. He spent the next 2 days digging trenches, clearing the ground around the site. The soil was rich beneath the burned crust, dark and cool. When he struck a buried pipe running east, his heart leapt. Fielding had been preparing for this. The line led toward the ridge, half collapsed but intact enough to guide the flow once open. Walter followed it, shoveling carefully, until he reached a broken valve capped with rust. When he turned it, there was resistance. Then a hiss, and suddenly, water erupted in a thin stream, spraying into the sunlight. It glittered as it fell, clean and pure. For the first time in years, the land smelled alive. He laughed, a sound rough with disbelief. The mule startled at the noise, backing away. But Walter didn't stop laughing. The water pooled in the trench, darkening the soil. He knelt and pressed his hands into it, feeling the cool seep into his skin. This was what they had tried to hide. This was what Fielding had died to protect. He filled a jar with the water, sealed it tight, and placed it beside the letters. When the world saw this proof, no forged deed could erase it. But that night, as the stars came out, he realized he was not alone. The hum of engines returned, closer than before. Headlights swept across the far hills, cutting through the darkness like white knives. Then came the sound of voices, muffled but unmistakable. Walter grabbed his rifle and moved toward the fire pit, crouching low. A pair of figures appeared near the fence, flashlights flickering as they crossed the property line. He could hear their footsteps, the crunch of gravel, the metallic click of something, tools or weapons he couldn't tell. He waited until they were near the burned wagon before stepping into the open. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice carrying through the night. The lights froze on him. One of the men spoke. "We don't want trouble, Mr. Green. Just business." "Business burned my wagon," Walter said. "You can tell Mason I'm not selling." The second man shifted. "You don't own what's under this ground. It belongs to the company. You keep digging, you'll drown in it." Walter raised the rifle slightly, not aiming, but enough to make them see he wasn't afraid. "Then I'll drown standing." They hesitated, exchanged a look, then backed away. "You can't keep it hidden forever," one of them said. "The law's already moving." They turned and left, their voices fading into the hum of the engine that carried them away. He stood there long after the sound disappeared, the rifle still in his hands. The stars looked sharper now, and the night wind was colder. He knew they were right about one thing: he couldn't keep it hidden forever. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. When he returned to the truck, he saw the letters spread across the seat, the map open beneath them. They were more than relics. They were evidence. And somewhere beyond this valley, there were people who would listen if only he could reach them. At dawn, he drove toward the next county, following a route marked faintly on Fielding's old map. There, in a small town called Taro Bend, lived a woman whose name had appeared in one of the letters, Dr. Sarah McKenna, a historian who had once corresponded with Fielding about land records. Walter found her house on the edge of town, surrounded by books and overgrown roses. She answered the door with cautious eyes, studying the stranger who stood before her, covered in soot and dust. When he said Fielding Green's name, her expression changed. "I thought that story died with him," she said quietly. "Not yet," Walter replied, placing the tin box in her hands. She read in silence for a long time, her brow furrowing as she traced the handwriting. When she looked up again, her face was pale but resolute. "If this is true, it's bigger than one man's land. It means they built half their operations on stolen water rights." Walter nodded. "Then let's make them remember." By the time he returned to his property, the sun was sinking low, painting the valley in blood-red light. He felt a strange calm, the kind that comes before a storm. Sarah had promised to contact universities, lawyers, even the press if she had to. The truth would come out. But as he parked the truck near the ruins, he saw fresh tire marks cutting across the road and new footprints in the dust near the ridge. He followed them slowly, rifle in hand, until they vanished by the hidden lid. The metal surface was smeared with fresh oil. Someone had tried to pry it open again. He stood there in the fading light, his shadow stretching long across the earth. The world was beginning to stir, drawn by the scent of water and memory. He knew now that this fight would not end quietly. Somewhere beyond the hills, engines were already turning, bringing with them the men who had forgotten what justice meant. And as darkness closed over the valley, Walter whispered to the wind, "Then let them come. The land remembers, even if they don't." The following dawn broke heavy with heat and silence. A faint fog lingered near the ground, rising from the wet trench Walter had carved days earlier. The scent of earth and water filled the air, a smell this land had not known for half a century. Walter stood at the edge of the ridge, his boots sunk in damp soil, watching the steam curl like ghostly threads into the first light of morning. It was as if the valley itself had begun to breathe again. Behind him, the ruins of the wagon lay half buried in ash, blackened wood glinting faintly with dew. He could still hear Fielding's voice in the old letters, urging him to protect the water, to let it live. Now that it had surfaced again, it was no longer only his secret. It belonged to the land. The road leading into Green Creek was not empty that morning. By the time the sun climbed high enough to burn away the mist, the first vehicles appeared. A news van from the county station, a pair of pickup trucks with cameras and notebooks, and behind them, a black SUV that Walter recognized immediately. Mason had returned, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the mud as he stepped out. He adjusted his tie, his face composed but his eyes colder than before. "Mr. Green," he called out, "you've made quite the spectacle. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Walter didn't answer. He stood with his hands on the shovel handle, the water behind him gleaming in the sunlight like a mirror. Within hours of Sarah's visit to the universities and the regional archive, the story had spread. Fielding Green's letters, the old deeds, the discovery of the underground reservoir, all of it had reached the public. Now the land was filled with strangers, drawn not by greed but by curiosity, by justice, by the need to see for themselves the truth buried under decades of lies. Mason's company could no longer bury it in silence. Reporters approached with cautious steps, their microphones trembling slightly in the wind. "Is it true, Mr. Green?" one asked. "Did you find the original documents proving your family's ownership?" Another shouted, "Are you aware that the Harlan Corporation is filing for an injunction?" Walter looked at them, their cameras glinting like eyes, and felt no fear. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "It's all true. My family was cheated, my ancestor was called a madman, and they tried to burn what he left behind. But the land kept the truth. It remembered when everyone else forgot. Behind the crowd, Mason's expression tightened. He motioned for his driver, whispering something low. Walter saw the flash of anger cross his face, but it was the look of a man cornered by his own deceit. For years, Harlan Water and Resources had drained the valley dry, diverting its natural wells for profit, hiding the source beneath falsified records. Now the evidence was public. Sarah had sent copies of every document to the State Archive, the Environmental Bureau, and the press. There was no more secrecy left to sell. The day unfolded in a blur of questions, interviews, and strangers walking carefully around the newly uncovered trench. They called it a miracle, a rediscovered wellspring, a symbol of reclamation. Walter barely spoke after that. He stood apart, watching as the townspeople who had once mocked him arrived in dusty trucks and stared in disbelief at the stream cutting across the barren field. One of them, the man from the diner, removed his hat and said quietly, "I'll be damned. You did it." There was no laughter this time, only respect, a hesitant, awkward respect born of shame and wonder. That night, when the reporters had left and the sky turned deep blue, Walter built a small fire where the wagon used to stand. The mule slept nearby, its flank rising and falling steadily. The sound of running water filled the silence, soft and steady. He opened the tin box one last time, spread the letters across his lap, and read the final page aloud to the wind. "If you are blood of my blood," it said, "know that our inheritance is not gold or land, but memory. The earth holds what men forget. Guard it, and it will guard you." He folded the page carefully and placed it back in the box, then buried it beneath a flat stone beside the well. When the last handful of dirt fell, he stood and looked up at the stars. They shimmered faintly over the valley, reflected in the rippling surface of the new stream. For the first time, he felt peace. Not the quiet of surrender, but the calm that comes after a long fight when the truth finally stands on its own. Weeks passed, and Green Creek began to change. The water spread slowly across the valley floor, seeping into the roots of grass long dead, filling the air with the hum of insects and the distant call of birds returning after years of absence. Farmers from nearby counties arrived to test the soil, to speak with Walter, to offer hands for rebuilding. He accepted little, but he did not refuse them. Together they repaired fences, cleared the burned debris, and planted the first rows of seed. The land responded like a creature waking from hibernation, its scent rich and alive. One morning a letter arrived from the courthouse, the same seal that had once brought him here months before. It bore the final judgment, the green estate restored, the frauds of Harlan Corporation exposed. Mason and his associates faced charges of falsification and illegal exploitation of state resources. Walter read it slowly, then folded it without emotion. Justice had come, not as thunder or vengeance, but as quiet correction. The land would no longer be stolen. It would be worked and remembered. On the day of the memorial, the townspeople gathered by the ridge. A stone marker stood beside the flowing stream, carved with simple words, "In memory of Fielding, Green, and those who kept faith with the earth." Walter placed a small wooden box at its base. Inside was the doll he had found buried near the wagon, the one Fielding's letter had mentioned as belonging to a little girl lost long ago. He set it gently in the soil and whispered, "You can rest now." The crowd stood silent as he covered it, the sound of shovelfuls of dirt merging with the steady murmur of water. When the ceremony ended and the others left, Walter remained alone. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, though the sky was clear. He sat by the stream, his reflection rippling with the current. This was not the future he had imagined when he'd first read that letter in Kansas, but it was something better. The land had tested him, stripped him of everything false, and left him only what was true work, endurance, and the quiet pride of a man who refused to let history vanish. As evening fell, he locked the rebuilt barn, fed the mule, and walked to the porch of the small cabin he'd raised from the wagon's salvaged boards. On the wall hung a framed copy of Fielding's map, and beside it, the faded parchment deed with the old family seal. Above them, in a simple wooden frame, He had written the words that now defined everything he had learned. The real inheritance is not what is given to you, but what you fight to return. The sky darkened, and the valley shimmered beneath the last light of day. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled softly, promising rain. Walter closed his eyes and listened. The rhythm of the land and the pulse of the buried water blending into one heartbeat. For the first time in years, he felt not like a man chasing a lost legacy, but like part of something eternal, a keeper of memory, bound to soil and time. When the first drops of rain began to fall, he smiled faintly. The ground around him drank eagerly, darkening under the weight of renewal. The storm gathered, washing the ash from the ruins, carrying it into the stream until the water turned silver in the moonlight. Walter stood at the door of his cabin, hat in hand, watching the valley come alive again. In the distance, where the fire had once raged, wildflowers were beginning to bloom. And just before he went inside, the sound of hooves approached along the wet road. The postman, drenched and grinning, handing him a sealed envelope. "Another one for you, Mr. Green," he said. The paper bore a familiar emblem, the state archives. Walter took it, nodded his thanks, and stepped back into the light of the lantern. As he broke the seal, his eyes traced the first line. "We have located additional documentation concerning unclaimed property once belonging to the Green family." He looked out at the rain-soaked hills, the water glistening over the earth, and exhaled slowly. The story, it seemed, was not over. Somewhere beyond that horizon, another secret waited to be unearthed. And as the thunder rolled across the valley, Walter Green felt the old fire in his chest spark once more. Not of anger now, but of purpose. The land had chosen him to remember, and he would not let it down. If this story moved you, don't just scroll, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next one will shock you even more. Watch our other stories and share this video so everyone can see how it ends.